host joining us. So thank you. Appreciate you.
I can tell you in just a second.
Appreciate you tuning in.
30 days, we have been watched in 3 different countries, across 24 states, in 40 cities with an approximate total of 56 viewers.
Wow. Very nice.
And I don't know if they're able to track the Roku viewers or not.
Yeah.
So, could be more than that.
Okay, well anyway, great to have you kind of tagging along with us. We're right here just doing our simple thing, and we encourage anybody and everybody to do the same. You don't have to stream it, of course, but get your neighbors, friends, relatives, and have a weekly study of some type, and use God's Word and learn some things. But we're glad you're following along.
Susan clarified that her sister lives in Brandon, Manitoba, directly north of Fargo, North Dakota. Definitely one of the coldest places in the United
My
States.
parents used to live in Fargo, North Dakota.
Very cold.
Those are the places where the shopping centers have outlets where you can plug in your heaters when you're
your vehicles. You have to.
Your car heaters.
Of course. Things get too stiff when it gets that cold.
Yeah.
My body's warm.
Really tighten up. Anyway, let's go ahead and open with a word of prayer, and then we'll get to our story. Father, we want to praise you and thank you for who you are, and the fact that you take such good care of us from week to week, day to day. I'm glad that we're here this morning, and that the weather isn't too bad for us to be here. And we pray, Lord, that you watch over all of our friends and loved ones that are out there at various places today. I want to thank you for all those that are tuning in online and watching. We pray, Lord, that your Spirit will provide a blessing for each person as well. Also, we want to ask that you remember those on our prayer list, which is pretty extensive. You know all the circumstances, you know every need, you are the great physician. You help in so many wonderful ways, and we just give these folks to you. We offer our list up to you in hands of praise, and trust you, Lord, to take care of all the situations. And thank you. We ask as we study today that your word will be a fitting representation of what we need and the insight that we need to understand. So we ask, Lord, that you guide and direct us through your Spirit, and we ask these mercies in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen and amen.
I was just thinking we need to get our prayer list, maybe put it up on the website so we can make that a little more interactive, where we can actually put down the list of things that people we've been praying for and situations, and then we can actually put in when things have been answered or something has changed with those, and that we can encourage people to submit prayer requests on the website.
Good suggestion.
Because there's a lot of, Titus's wife called me yesterday, and he's in the hospital. They're wanting to do radiation on a couple of spots on his spine because of the cancer had metastasized there. I know Barbara said her sister wasn't doing well with her kidney function was messed up. A lot of people have had, a difficult week. My sister started her chemo this week too, so just a lot of people that are hurting and struggling right now.
Yeah, I have a friend that had surgery yesterday. She had cancer in her breast, and now it spread to her spine, her back. Yeah, so she had to have it like a part of her spine replaced. And and she's gonna have to start chemo and radio. And the thing is that she's vegan and she does juice cleanses all the time, but she's been vegan for
is one
years
of those things
and years.
that is not just dependent on how you live your life. It's exposures to toxins, exposures to radiation, vaccines. There's so many things that can trigger it. It can be. It isn't just one thing. She's probably made it this long because she's been healthy.
Yeah.
But the same thing, same can be said for any of us. The older we get, the more weak our immune system gets.
How old is she?
She's, I think
Younger
she's almost 50.
Oh, so she's an older person.
Yeah, she's an older person, yeah.
She's a middle-aged person.
Yeah.
Well, I said older than her.
Older, yeah.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking, if it's a friend of yours, maybe
Yeah,
she's a young
family.
person,
Yeah.
Other family, sure.
It's hard going through that.
Anyway, yeah, it is. Disease is not discriminatory. I mean, it just, anywhere, anytime, any place, it can happen because of all the variables out there, like Rose mentioned.
And I think, too, that one of the worst burdens that we can put on people is to imply that somehow when these things happen, it's because you didn't live your life the right way.
Right.
And,
Yeah,
or
we're
you know,
just
that somehow you brought this on yourself,
Sure.
and that's not, you know, the human condition is such. The pediatrician that I used to take the kids to, fantastic doctor, was a runner, very healthy. He was 36 years old when they found he had lung cancer, and he died very shortly after that. You know,
And he never smoked.
never smoked.
Yeah.
Oh,
He
yeah.
was a marathon runner. He was, you know, healthy as he could be, and to get lung cancer at 36 and die, you know.
Yeah, and like you said, maybe he
Heartbreaking.
lived an extra 10 years because he was in
Yeah,
relatively good
we're all
condition.
born with a certain amount of junk circulating in our systems that, and then all the exposures, and it's just, you know, there's no telling what flips
Triggers.
the switch.
Yeah, what flips the switch. Could be a host of things.
We can just do the best we can
Yeah, so.
and have prayer. Prayer heals a lot of things.
All right, so we're
Okay, our
continuing our story, and tell folks a little bit about the story.
Well, this is this Present Darkness is a Christian novel that was written by Frank Peretti some years ago, and it's detailing the outward signs and the behind the scenes looks
The
at
angelic
spiritual
warfare. Yeah, spiritual warfare.
Of, you know, that there's stuff that goes on behind the scenes. When we see certain things happening outwardly, we don't recognize that there are forces behind the scenes that are
Yeah.
in play.
And we don't ever think because it's oblivious to us. We don't think
they're
of,
invisible.
we don't think of the angelic warfare that's going on all around us.
Right.
So very seldom do they make their presence known. So.
But I know when I read this book to the kids years ago, it was every time I would stop reading a chapter, read one more, because they really liked this story in the sense of understanding what was happening behind the scenes.
So what chapter are we on?
I don't know what the number is
okay.
right now. It doesn't give me the chapter numbers here. I stop when there's a section break when they shift scenes.
Yeah. Okay.
The Friday edition of the Clarion was on the streets, and the usual post-publication lull around the office gave Bernice the chance she needed to do some hoofing. She had been waiting eagerly for a chance to get over to Whitmore College and talk to some people, and a few phone calls had landed her an important lunch appointment. The North Campus cafeteria was a new addition, a modern red brick structure with floor-to-ceiling blue-tinted windows and carefully kept flower gardens. You could eat inside at a small 2 or 4 person table, or sit on the patio in the sunshine. The format was buffet and the food wasn't bad. Bernice stepped onto the patio carrying a tray with coffee and a light salad, and beside her was Ruth Williams, a cheerful middle-aged professor in economics carrying a taco salad. They found a secluded table in the semi-shade, and for the first half of their meal they indulged in small talk and catching up. But Williams knew Bernice pretty well by now. "Bernice," she said at last, "I can tell you have something on your mind." And Bernice was able to be honest with her friend. "Ruth, it's something unprofessional and distasteful." "Do you mean to say you've uncovered something new?" "Oh no, not about Pat. No, that subject's been dormant for quite some time. You can be sure it will reawaken if anything new comes up, though." Bernice looked at Williams for a long moment. "You don't think I'll ever find anything, do you?" "Bernice, you know I support you in your efforts 100%, but with that support I must add my sincere doubts that your efforts will ever uncover anything. It was just so futile, so tragic." Bernice shrugged. "Well, that's why I'm trying to refocus my efforts only where they'll do some good. Which brings me to the uncomfortable subject for the day. Did you know I was arrested and jailed Sunday night?" Williams was, of course, incredulous. "Jailed? Whatever for?" "Soliciting an undercover cop for an act of prostitution." That brought the right response from Williams. Bernice went on to tell her as much of the indignities as she could remember. "I can't believe it," Williams kept saying. "That's disgusting. I can't believe it." "Well, anyway," Bernice said, bringing in the punchline, "I feel I have good cause to question Mr. Brummel's motives. Mind you, I have only theory and speculation, but I want to chase these things to their end to see if anything really lies behind them." Ruth said, "Well, I can understand that, but what could I possibly know that would help you?" "Have you ever met Professor Julian Langstradt over in the psychology department?" "Well, once or twice. We shared a table at a faculty luncheon." Bernice caught a glint of distaste in William's facial expression. Something wrong with her?" "Well, to each his own," said Ruth, stirring her salad absent-mindedly with her fork. "But I found her very difficult to relate to. It was next to impossible to start any coherent conversation." "How does she carry herself? Is she forceful, retiring, assertive, obnoxious? Well, aloof for one thing, and I guess mysterious, although I use that word for lack of one better. I get the impression that people are nothing but a bore to her. Her academic interests are very esoteric and metaphysical, and she seems to prefer them to bland reality. What kind of company does she keep? Well, I wouldn't know. I'd almost be surprised to find her consorting with anyone at all. So you've never seen her in the company of Alf Brummel? Oh, this must be the goal of your questions. No, never at all. But I guess you don't see her much anyway. No, she's not very social. But listen, I really try to mind my own business, if you catch my meaning. I would definitely like to help you in any way I can. To satisfy yourself concerning Pat's death, however. But what you're after this time is unprofessional and distasteful, Bernice finished for her. Yes, you were certainly right on that score. But accompanied with my own advice to disengage yourself from this thing. Let me, as a friend, refer you to someone who might know more. Have your pencil ready? His name is Albert Darr, and he's in the psychology department. From what I've heard, mostly from him, he rubs shoulders with Langstratt every day, doesn't like her at all, and loves to gossip. I'll even go so far as to call him for you. Albert Darr, a baby-faced young professor with stylish clothes and a certain penchant for ladies, just happened to be in his office grading papers. And he had time to talk, especially with lovely reporter like Bernice. Well, hello, hello, he said as she came in the door. Well, hello, hello yourself, she responded. Bernice Kruger, a friend of Ruth Williams. Ah, he looked to and fro for an empty chair and finally moved a pile of books. And have a seat, pardon the mess. He sat down on another pile of books and papers that might have had a chair under it. What can I do for you? Well, this really isn't an official visit, Professor Darr. Just call me Albert. Thank you, Albert. I'm actually here on a personal matter, but if my theories are right, it could be important in a newsworthy sense. She paused to indicate a new paragraph and a difficult question. Now, Ruth tells me you know Julian Langstratt. Albert Darr suddenly smiled broadly, leaned back in his piled-up chair, and put his hands behind his neck. This was going to be an enjoyable subject for him, it seemed. Aha, he said gleefully, so you dare to infringe on sacred ground. He looked around the room in mock suspicion, searching for imaginary eavesdroppers, and then leaned forward and said in a lowered voice, Listen, there are certain things no one is supposed to know, not even myself. But then he brightened up and said, But our dear professor has had many an occasion to hurt and slight me, and therefore I feel indebted to her not the least. I'm dying to answer your questions. Evidently Bernice could just dive right in. This guy didn't seem to need formalities. Well, to begin with, she said, readying her pen, I'm really trying to find out about Alf Brummel, the chief of police. I've been informed he and Langstratt see a lot of each other. Can you verify that? Oh, definitely. So they do have something going. What do you mean, something? Well, you fill in the blanks. If you mean a romantic fling, he smiled and shook his head. Oh dear, I don't know if you'll like this answer, but no, I don't think anything like that is going on. But he does see her quite regularly. Oh yes, but a lot of people do. She gives consultations in her off hours. But tell me now, doesn't Brummel see her on a weekly basis? With ebbing spirit, Bernice answered, Yes, every Tuesday, on the dot. Well, there, you see, he goes to her for regular weekly sessions. But why won't he tell anybody? He's very secretive about it. Albert leaned forward and lowered his voice. Everything Langstratt does is a deep, dark secret. The inner circle, Bernice. No one is even supposed to know about these so-called consultations. But no one is on the privileged, the elite, the powerful, and the many special patrons that go to her. That's the way she is. But what's she up to? Mind you now, he said with a mischievous glint in his eye, this is privileged information, and I might caution you that it is not entirely reliable. I know very little of this from direct observation. Most I've just managed to pick up around the department here. Fortunately, Professor Langstratt has made enough enemies that a few of the staff don't feel any commitment or loyalty to her. He repositioned himself into an eye-to-eye posture. Bernice, Professor Langstratt is, how should I say it, not a ground-level person. Her areas of study go beyond anything the rest of us have had any desire to tamper with. The source, the universal mind, the ascended planes. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about, Bernice said. Oh, none of us know what she's talking about either. Some of us are very concerned. We don't know if she's very brilliant and making some real breakthroughs or if she's somewhat deranged. Well, what is all this stuff, this source, this mind stuff? Well, as nearly as we can tell, it derives from the Eastern religions, the old mystic cults and writings, things I know nothing about and don't want to know anything about. As far as I'm concerned, her studies in these areas have caused her to lose contact with reality. As a matter of fact, I may even be mocked and maligned among my peers for saying this, but I don't see her advances in these areas as anything other than foolish neo-pagan witchcraft. I think she's desperately confused. Bernice now called to mind Marshall's strange descriptions of Langstratt. I've heard she does strange things to people. Foolishness, sheer foolishness. I think she believes she can read my mind, control me, put spells on me, whatever. I simply dismiss it and try very hard to be elsewhere when she's around. But does any of it have credence? Absolutely not. The only people she can control or affect are poor dupes in the inner circle who are stupid and gullible enough to... The inner circle, you've used that term before. He held up his hand to caution her. No facts, no facts. I coined that title myself. All I have is a 2 here and 2 there, which make a very persuasive 4. I've heard her admit that she counsels these people who come to her, and I've noticed some of them are quite important. But how could a counselor with such warped ideas possibly straighten anyone else out? Then again, I would expect her to claim a special advantage in such a situation. Who knows? Maybe she holds seances and mind-reading sessions. Maybe she cooks slugs' tails and newt's eyes and serves them with breaded spider legs to evoke some answer from the supernatural. But now I'm getting facetious. Well, do you see this as a possibility? Well, not nearly as bizarre as I've described, but yes, something along those lines, in keeping with her occult interests. And these people in the inner circle see her regularly? As far as I know, I really have no idea how it's set up or why people even go. What on earth could they be getting out of it? Can you give me some for instances? Well, he thought for a moment. Well, I've already mentioned and verified you're Mr. Brummel. And you might know of Ted Harmel. Bernice just about dropped her pen. Ted? Yes, the former editor of the Clarion. I worked for him before he left and Hogan bought the paper. Well, the way I understand it, Mr. Harmel didn't just leave. No, he fled. But who else? Mrs. Pinkston, a trustee on the Board of Regents. Ah, so it's not just men. Certainly not. Go on, go on. Well, who else? I think Dwight Brandon. Who's Dwight Brandon? He only owns the property the college is built on. Isabel, hush. Oh, so she wrote the name down with a bold-lettered explanation. And then there's Eugene Baylor. He's a general treasurer and a very influential man on the Board of Regents, I understand. It seems he's been needled just a little about whatever it is he and the professor do in their sessions together, but he remains self-righteous and steadfast in his convictions. And there's that reverend fellow, that Oliver Young. How did you know? Bernice smiled. Just a lucky guess. Carry on. So it's getting deeper into the mysteries of what's going on here. Yeah, it's getting chilly, huh?
Yeah.
Damp. So, on to the next one. Next part of the program.
Okay, all squared away?
Yep.
Okay, very good.
Put Isabel upstairs.
I just put her in the back room.
Oh.
So. All right, well, very good. Pick that up next week and go from there.
A little more hot tea. I'm cold over here. Draft coming across my feet.
Well, last week I had mentioned that our youngest, Simeon, would be doing this study today, but I didn't realize he was going to be out of town today, and so I thought I would go ahead and pinch hit for him. And what we're going to be talking, he's going to be talking about the 10 Commandments. I think he's going to do a couple of weeks on the Commandments. And so before we get to that, I thought, well, it would be nice to see a little bit about where the commandments actually came from. So we're going to talk this morning about Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai. And if you'll notice, for those of you that are watching online, this is the Mount Sinai right here, the blackened peak of Mount Sinai, where God came down. And basically, I just wanted to start out this morning by asking a simple question, and that would be, you know, why did God decide to take them there? Right? What was God's purpose in taking this group of people to Mount Sinai? In fact, if you recount the story, you remember when of course God's people had been in Egypt. How did they get down to Egypt, by the way?
Joseph.
Okay, again, the background is that Joseph ended up in Egypt, and as the story goes, God kind of sent him there in advance to prepare the way to preserve the Jewish people, or the nation, what would become the nation of Israel. And now when they got down there, of course, there was some reunion. If you go back through Genesis and read the story, the last 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, from chapters 39 on to 50, really concentrate on this one story of Joseph going down to Egypt, and how he ended up becoming the ruler, second in command behind the Pharaoh. And of course, you had the 7 years of plenty, the 7 years of famine, and all that kind of thing. And so that's how everybody ended up, the 70 souls that were part of the family left in Canaan, ended up getting down into Egypt itself. Now, how long did they stay down in Egypt? I mean, they were down there for quite some time, weren't they?
400 years?
Okay, it's interesting, the scriptures mention 430. When you look at the Exodus scenario there. In chapter 12 of Exodus, I believe, it talks about that they were there for 430 years. This is chapter 12, toward the end of the chapter there. It says, "Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. It came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on the very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt." Now, there's a little bit of a, you could read that and you could assume that they were enslaved in Egypt for 430 years, but it doesn't say that. It says that the sojourn of the children of Israel, the one who lived in Egypt, was 430 years. Their sojourn, or their journey toward the promised land, began when? That's what you have to determine. When did it actually begin? Of course, when they got down to Egypt, they were welcomed and they were kind of honored. They were given the best land, the land of Goshen. And of course, because of that, their 70 started to grow rather quickly. And probably for quite a long time, as long as the current Pharaoh was alive, they had privilege in the land of Egypt because Joseph had saved the entire country, right?
There's also something that I'd read about some of the Jewish people who lived in Egypt actually attained other political positions in the government by virtue of being connected with Joseph over the years.
Yeah, well, you can imagine, I think that they were actually enslaved for probably maybe 100 or 200 years. Right?
And because the selling into slavery took place as the famine wore on.
Right. So they had to go through all that kind of stuff. And of course they grew to become a great nation, and the new Pharaoh came in and said, hey, they've become mightier than even we are, and if they formed an alliance with one of our enemies, we could be overrun from within. So they started killing them off, and of course then you had the story of Moses in the basket boat and that kind of thing taking place. But they ended up leaving Egypt basically the same day that Abraham, as many know him, ended up starting his journey at 75 years. If you go back to Genesis 12, here you're in Exodus 12, you go back to Genesis 12, you find Abraham being called to become a nation of mighty people that would impact the entire world. And he left Haran when he was 75, and he was headed to the Promised Land. Now, of course, him and Lot, they ended up getting there, and of course, the promise was basically stated that this is where your descendants will inherit this land, that kind of thing. Well, lots of things happened between the time that Abraham was first there and the time that they're leaving Egypt and actually heading there themselves. But God doesn't take them immediately there. God doesn't just say, okay, you're leaving Egypt, I'm going to take you back to Canaan and so you can inherit the land. There are other things that have to take place before they get there. And one of those things is God's going to bring them to Mount Sinai for specific reasons. Right? Now, what's interesting about the story in the Exodus itself is that Moses and Aaron weren't asking Pharaoh to let us go to Mount Sinai, let us go into the land of Midian. They didn't say that. What did they say? What was their...
They said they wanted to go out into the desert and offer the sacrifices.
Yeah, they wanted to go 3 days. 3 days into the desert to offer sacrifices, etc.
Which is a parallel to the 3 days that Abraham took with Lot, with Isaac.
With Isaac, right?
To go up to Mount Moriah.
Yeah, also the 3 days of the baker and the butler story in Genesis. That story specifically, if you remember when Joseph was in prison and he interpreted the dreams of the baker and the butler, in 3 days, the one would be destroyed and the other would be restored to his position. And that's really what happened to Israel during the Exodus. They were 3 days coming out of Egypt, and the baker, who was a symbol of all of the plenty and all the sustenance that Egypt could afford to offer, that nation was destroyed at the Red Sea. And of course the butler, who was a servant, God was calling his people to become servants, and they reflected the birthing of this new nation of Israel. And that all happened within 3 days. Egypt was destroyed, and Israel was kind of reborn there at the Red Sea. And their journey there was 3 days. But when they went in to talk to Pharaoh, right? When they initially went in to talk to Pharaoh, and that goes all the way back, chapter 7 and 8 of Exodus. When they first went in there, they basically said, the Lord, in fact, chapter 6 here, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, it's chapter 6, verse 1, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of this land. Even before that, chapter 5, coming back one chapter there, after Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. This is where Pharaoh says, who's the Lord that I should obey his voice and let you go? I don't know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. And they said to him, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. So they're basically saying, if you don't let us go, God's going to judge us with pestilence and the sword.
Well, they could have been using us collectively, like, God's told us that things are going to happen, we need to go and get things right with him, or he may be causing problems for the whole country.
Well, ultimately that's
Pharaoh wouldn't care if something happened to the Israelites. He wanted to get rid of them anyway.
Well, not really all of them, because they were a mighty labor force for him. Okay, so that's one of the things that they told Moses and Aaron. The Pharaoh said to him,
He wasn't going to end up with much of the labor force when he was killing off all the baby boys.
In fact, the very
Kinda
next
like
the very
United
next
States with the
verse.
abortion, cutting off our nose to spite our
Right,
face,
exactly,
you know?
exactly.
Now we don't have enough workforce to support
Support
social
Social
security or
Security.
anything.
Yeah, thank you very much. The next verse says, "Then the king of Egypt said to them, Moses and Aaron, why do you take the people from their work? Get back to your labor." You know, in other words, what are you rolling things up for? You know, what's this whole thing about going into the desert to worship, etc., for 3 days? You know,
They wouldn't have understood that because they didn't do anything of that.
Yeah.
Everything they did was right there in the city. You know, their temple was probably right outside the city gates,
yeah. So,
and they worshipped all kinds of nature. That's why when they threw the baby boys into the river, they had a crocodile was one of their gods.
so Pharaoh
They're
said,
making an offering to their gods.
"Look, the people of the land are many now, and you make them rest from their labor." So, of course, this is where he commanded the taskmasters, you know, to take certain things from them and make it a little more difficult for them to do their work, etc. But eventually, they end up, as you know the story, they end up leaving on the Passover. This is where the Passover comes into play. Of course, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and also the wave sheaf offering kind of thing. So you've got
I wonder if during that time they were in Egypt, if the Israelites had completely stopped observing their whatever, you know, from what I've read, it seems like these feast days were actually part of God's people from the beginning.
well, some people would insist that they go even all the way back to Noah.
Right.
You know, but I mean, in other words, the true believers always had these things because the plan of salvation goes all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden.
Right.
And so a lot of people believe that they've always existed for God's people as reminders of the main aspects of the plan of salvation, i.e. being the first coming and also the second coming, which is what they all were rehearsing and pointing towards. All right, so Moses and Aaron are asking the Pharaoh, let's go into the wilderness for 3 days. But there's never any indication that they're going to come back. I mean, he doesn't say, and Pharaoh doesn't say either, well, if I let you go into the wilderness, you know, you'll never come back. You'll keep on going. That issue really is never talked about or brought up. But they keep asking for this 3-day thing, and of course the Pharaoh resists, and you know the story. But God has other things in mind. He wants to get them to this mountain right here. You see back here, those that are looking, he wants to get them to the land of Midian and Mount Sinai. Why does he want to take them there?
I have a feeling Moses was asking the same thing. I mean,
Well,
Moses fled there.
He had been there once before.
He lived there
So
for
he
he
knew.
lived there for 40 years.
He knew the area.
And he knew it was kind of a desolate area, you know, he was keeping the flocks there, but it doesn't sound like it was a very desirable area, and I'm sure he had to wonder why God wants to bring these people back here.
Right, and obviously when Moses went there the first time, he didn't cross through the Red Sea. Okay, he went the easier way, up and around the finger of the Gulf of Aqaba and down into the land of Midian. So I'm sure he was very familiar with that route, but yet God didn't want to take him that way. I mean, they started to kind of go in that direction when they came off out of Ramses, which was the land of Goshen. They kind of all came out of that area at the proper time, and they staged. What do I mean by staged? They camped. They came together from their homes in a place called Succoth, ancient Succoth, and that was on the Sukkoth. That would have been the
People today don't understand that word, they'll think it's something different.
yeah, right. Just
Doesn't
an ancient.
sound like a great place to live.
Yeah.
It sucketh greatly.
It's so greatly. Yeah. But well, you can imagine hundreds of thousands of people showing up, you know, in your little town, right? Anyway, it was a staging
the
area.
best land in the world. We call it Succoth.
It was a staging area for them to kind of come together and kind of get organized and so forth. And that was on the east side of the Gulf of Suez already. So there would have been no issue of crossing the Gulf of Suez, which is where most scholars initially looked for a crossing site. And many say that, they crossed the Sea of Reeds, that the Red Sea actually, the word means reeds, Reed Sea. And they went across in 6 inches of water kind of thing, because of the time of year, whatnot. Totally taking out of consideration the actual miracle that took place. In fact, you'll see right here, this is the actual beach area that they came out on. And this is the Wadi Latir, and this is the Gulf of Aqaba. And all of this beach area is erosion that came out, runoff from the flood event, which happened 1,500 years earlier. And what nobody knew is that across this gulf, 8 or 9 miles, all of this sediment that had run out from the land on both sides ended up forming a land bridge underneath. And it had been sitting there for 1,500 years, ready to be used for this particular event, culminating in the Exodus, where they would end up crossing.
It's got to be interesting to have been Moses, because him being involved in the military as one of the leaders of Egypt for most of his adult life before he fled,
Right.
he knew the land.
Yeah.
And when God starts leading them and then takes them down into this wadi,
Cuts them off.
and he
Yeah.
knows that they're going to end up on this beach, he's got to be wondering, Lord, what are you up to? He had to have been at some level just as confused as
Yeah.
the people were, because you're going to something that's totally unproductive.
And of course, hindsight's always 20/20. I mean, why did God take them? Why did God cut them off the main road and take them down into this? In fact, what was Pharaoh, who had gotten the reports, he said, Moses' God must be a bad general because he's led them right into a trap. The mountains just,
They're ensnared in the
they're
land.
snared in the land. They were enclosed in. And that was Pharaoh's contention, that they were trapped, and so it was going to be easy. They were going to be easy prey for the army and the military to go in there and kind of wipe them out. And Pharaoh sent 251,000 of his troops. He sent basically the entire army of Egypt after these now escapees, if you want to call them that.
I think he called for every able-bodied man in Egypt
Yeah,
to go after the Israelites,
yeah,
because that expression when you look at that, what happened with the queen after they all
right. The letter
drowned,
she
she
wrote.
wrote a letter to the Hittite king saying, I need to raise up sons. There's no man here.
Right.
They couldn't admit that they were defenseless,
Sure. Exactly.
but all they had were women and children left.
Pretty
and
much,
the aged.
and maybe older men,
Right.
yeah. So, the interesting thing is this miracle that took place is the most often mentioned miracle in the Bible, the crossing of the Red Sea. And God takes them there specifically because he knows that he needs to basically eliminate the Egyptian army, that they would always be a threat to this new nation. In fact, God takes them this way, and he wouldn't let them go the way, the road that went around to where the Philistines were, because it actually says in the commentary here in Scripture that if they saw conflict coming, they would want to go back to Egypt.
Well, they hadn't been prepared to do
There was
battle.
no preparation.
And plus, they didn't have any tools. They didn't have any weapons.
Right. And so God takes them to the Red Sea because he's going to do just that. He's going to provide them with weaponry. Because when the Egyptian army went into the sea, of course this is at night, they put all their weapons, they attached their weapons to their belts and so forth. And when in the morning when the ice ended up melting and breaking free, it pushed the entire army through the wadi and up onto the beach on the opposite side. And all the Israelites had to do is go down there and just collect the weapons off all of the bodies that were deposited there. But God's taking them to Mount Sinai for a reason. Why is he taking them to Mount Sinai? Well, let's look at a couple of reasons. If you go to Exodus chapter 19. Now I've driven from Cairo. I've driven out of Cairo to the Red Sea, and that's about a 7-hour drive by vehicle. And it was about a 3-day trip for the Israelites. And then after they get across the Red Sea, they have to, now they're in an area that is probably only familiar to Moses. But there's a cloud, there's a pillar still leading them, right? This pillar is still guiding and directing them as well, which is a supernatural thing. But it takes them about 50 days. On the 50th day, they're actually is God meeting with the people on the 50th day, which is kind of significant. But chapter 19 of Exodus, it says, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. So this is probably around day 47 or so, 46, 47. They're coming into the area there where Sinai is. For they had departed from Rephidim and had come to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. So God is bringing them there for a specific reason. He's eliminated the Egyptian army. He's shown the people that He is a mighty deliverer, and He brings them out of the land of Egypt, eliminates the army, provides weapons for them to fight future battles. And in verse 3 there says, Moses went up to God, and the Lord called him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you out on eagle's wings. In other words, they were like 3 days, which is a quick journey by foot to the Red Sea, and brought you to myself. And of course, God was there at Mount Sinai, so I guess we could say one of the first things, the reason He was bringing them there is because He was there, and He wanted them to come there as well.
There's a couple of things that come to mind for me.
Okay.
Number one is He had to take them out of Egypt,
Right.
and that's
So-
the next country over.
Yes.
Saudi Arabia
Right.
is the next
Right. If they had stopped in the Sinai Peninsula, which many people believe that Mount Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula, if they had stopped right there, then they would.
They would still be under Egyptian.
They would still be in Egypt technically. It was still Egyptian territory at that time. So yes, that's one of the reasons why He takes them to Sinai to
But
get them out.
I think
of
also too that part of the whole journey was showing them first off that He was a God of the impossible, which they had forgotten. They'd lost sight of who God was and what He could do and would do for His people.
Right.
And so He brings them to an absolute impossibility,
Right.
where they are trapped in this beach. There is absolutely no way
Big
out. The
army
Egyptian
behind
army's
you.
coming. The sea is so deep in front of them.
Right.
Who would ever have thought God would blow the seas away and give them a path through there on
Right.
dry ground? That was something that had never happened in all of recorded history. They had no reason to believe God would or could do something like
Sure.
that. And so you had to show them first off who He was. I mean, He'd shown them a little bit by virtue of the plagues in Egypt before they left. That some of the plagues only affected the Egyptians and didn't affect the children in Goshen and all that. And so they had a sense of that, but at the same time they could have said, well, these are natural events,
Just like today, people try to write God out of the equation.
Right.
So I'm sure that.
So they got to this place where there's this beach, and there
Yeah.
is absolutely nothing
No escape.
but God.
Yeah, that's it.
And that's what I think, that's just like the Gideon story, so that they could never say that they've done anything to rescue
Exactly.
themselves. It was totally a God thing all the way through.
Absolutely. So that's good. When you look at 19 here, it says, so we could say one of the reasons why God took him there is to get him out of Egypt, number one, to show His mighty power of deliverance, right? Because He wants them to trust, because what He's going to do there, as you read further down, He says, now therefore if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. Not only can God deliver you out of a city and give you a dry path through a sea, but He owns the whole planet. He owns the whole world, right? And so if you're I'm calling you to this place to develop a special relationship with you, right? I want you to become my envoys, my ambassadors for the entire planet. I mean, that's basically what He's calling His people to.
They somehow didn't get
A kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I want you to be the example of holiness and righteousness of the true one God that really is in control of the world and actually made the world. And so this is a special thing, a special treasure, it says here. You should be a special treasure to me above all people. All people have not had this opportunity for sure. Now this same sentiment is expressed in the New Testament, Titus, the 2nd chapter, verse 14. You can look that up, but very much is the same thinking here. Okay, so a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. These are the words that God is telling Moses to speak to the children of Israel. So Moses came and he called for the elders and whatnot, and laid before them all the words that the Lord had commanded them. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. So Moses goes back to God with those words, and
God had to be chuckling.
yeah.
We'll do whatever you say, Lord. And he's going, right.
Yeah, right.
I mean, 6 weeks after this miraculous deliverance, they're whining and complaining, you know. They just can't ever stop whining about anything. Human
Yeah.
beings are such weak. We think we are so tough and so strong and so cool.
Yeah, but we're not.
We're not anything
Yeah,
in that respect.
If we start to get a little inconvenienced, if things start to get a little inconvenient for us, we want
It's
to
raining again.
we want to complain. We want to think back of where it was good, where we were happier. And it's all in the moment type of stuff. It's not looking ahead. And that's the thing. We're so impulsive, and we don't really look ahead and keep the proper perspective. People fuss and complain about the stuff that they have to live with down here. Well, what do we know as Christians? What do we know is going to happen to everything that we own down here on this planet? It's all going to be destroyed, right? So why get attached to something, right? And why let things overwhelm you and really rule your life? Keep the proper perspective. And of course, these people have a lot to learn because they've been hundreds of years under Egyptian culture and philosophy. So there's an unteaching time that has to take place, as well as a teaching
But
instruction.
that's exactly what had to happen with Moses.
Moses,
That
right.
was the reason that he was in the wilderness for 40 years after fleeing Egypt. God had to unlearn all of the stuff, he had to unlearn all of the junk he had picked up in Egypt that made him think that he was self-sufficient and could handle everything.
Well, as somebody that's being trained has been trained in the military. Obviously, you're fit,
Tough as
you're
nails.
trained, you're tough, and you're self-reliant. And really, when you begin to think like that, what's the scripture say? Take heed lest ye fall.
And someone said that those who know what it's like taking care of sheep know what a preparation that was for leading the
Exactly.
children of Israel, because
Oh
sheep are the most stupid, unruly bunch to try to keep track of.
yeah. Okay. So the first 6 verses here basically identify God is taking the children of Israel to Mount Sinai because He has a special calling for them, a special job assignment, if you will, and He's going to provide them with other things as well to help prepare them to become the ambassadors for His kingdom. Okay, for truth, ambassadors for truth. Now, if you go back to Exodus chapter 6, we'll look at another reason. In Exodus chapter 6, the first 8 verses there, God is talking to Moses, and He says in verse 2, and God spoke to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, Lord, I was not known to them. I have also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers. And of course, so God takes them to Mount Sinai. He takes them through the Red Sea. He gets them to Mount Sinai to develop this special relationship with them. but it's also because he's fulfilling his promise. He's fulfilling his promise that he's using Mount Sinai as a staging area to fulfill that promise of giving them eventually the land of Canaan. Okay? And so he's got to get them ready for their entrance into the promised land. And he can't just, he could have taken them right out of Egypt and taken them right to the promised land, but he didn't do that. He makes this stop at Mount Sinai because he knows they need preparation. In fact, along the way, if you look in Exodus chapter 16, something starts happening along the way to Mount Sinai. And this little white stuff starts falling out of the sky, right? So on the way to Mount Sinai, God is going to be teaching them, even before they get there, about a kind of a reminder of who He is and His law, that He is going to write a transcript of eventually once they get there. And you remember when the manna came down, right? God tested them and illustrated to them the importance of His law and the importance of obedience to His law, even before they get to Mount Sinai. So God is teaching them along the way. He's trying to prepare them, and He uses Mount Sinai as this place that they can exist. How long were they there at Mount Sinai? Anybody know? Okay, they were there for over a year, right? And the reason they were there for over a year is because, again, God has to unteach them, just like Moses, and He has to reteach them. What does He use to reteach them about His plan of salvation?
The tabernacle.
Okay, the tabernacle.
Which took them the better part of that year to build.
To actually,
build.
yes.
Because
exactly.
you had to gather the materials and get the people working on it. It was a big project.
It was an incredibly big project. So
But hey, they're out in the middle of the desert. They got nothing better to do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And not only that, but to have the materials that they needed to actually pull that off is where did all that material come from? Where did all the gold and the silver and the silk and the
Precious stones.
where did all that stuff come from?
Egypt.
It came out of Egypt. And how did they get that out of Egypt?
They rooted it. They were given to them, wasn't it?
Yeah.
They spoiled Egypt.
Spoiled
in other
it,
words, in other words, God had told Moses. In other words, the Egyptians, after 10 plagues, especially after the 10th plague, but after all these plagues came along, the Egyptians were like, please, leave.
Well, I think also the Egyptians were not only wanting them to leave, but recognizing that their God was so powerful that what they were used to doing with their gods was offering things to them. So they gave them stuff to offer their God to get him out of their country and off their backs.
Yeah, please use this to appease your God kind of thing. Absolutely, I think all that's true. All right, so God's keeping His promise. He's calling the people to Mount Sinai. He's also going to provide them in Exodus 20. You have that's where the 10 Commandments. Simeon will focus on that over the next couple of weeks. Exodus chapter 20. God's going to provide a written transcript of the principles of His law. Okay? 2 tablets of stone, right? One that focuses on our relationship with God, and the other that focuses on our relationship with one another. Okay? So those two, and of course Jesus, remember in Matthew, He summarized those two.
It's the most simple legal system that has ever been devised.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at all of the laws that nations have put together to govern their people,
Right.
and God gave His people 10.
10 precepts.
10 precepts.
10 precepts.
Out of which all of the other laws can be derived. If you live on those 10 principles, it will impact the way you do business, the way you work with each other, the way you worship. All of those things will be part of it. But it's just so simple because all these other countries had massive codes of conduct and rules for everything, and God gave them these 10. It should have been a simple system.
Now you remember when God was going to meet with the people, and of course He came down on this mountain, and it says the mountain was all smoke. You see the picture back here. The top of the mountain is actually melted. And our friend Scott from Washington was kind enough when he was out there to bring us a couple of pieces of the top of the mountain. So thank you, Scott, for doing that. These are actually some of the rocks from the top of the mountain here that we have right here in the living room. These rocks were scorched and on fire from God's presence 3,500 years ago when this actually took place. And of course, Scott brought us a couple of samples. Mount Sinai is a very difficult place to get to because it's in Saudi Arabia, the ancient land of Midian. And so you can't just go over there and say, hey, I'm going to take a trip to Mount Sinai today and walk up the mountain there. They have it's opening up somewhat. Over the past, I'd say the past year, we've had folks that have gone on several tours over to Mount Sinai. It's easier now. It's quite expensive, but it's a little bit easier to get there now. In chapter 20 of Exodus, when God was going to meet with the people became quite afraid. In verse 18, chapter 20, it says, Now all the people witnessed the thunderings, the lightning flashes, the sound of the trumpets, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they trembled and stood afar off. Then they said to Moses, You go, you speak with us, and we'll hear you, but let not God speak with us, lest we die. One of the reasons why God, I would have thought that the Red Sea, that the plagues, and then the Red Sea opening up, I would have thought that would have been pretty impressive. Wouldn't that have really, I would have thought that I'd have been pretty impressed with all that. But now God is going to show up himself.
But when he shows up, the noise, you have thunder and earthquakes and lightning.
Right.
You have some pretty scary events. And they also had been hundreds of years in the midst of a very pagan culture,
Right.
where everything that happened had to do with gods and appeasing the wrath of the gods. Their whole spiritual experience had been so tainted by mingling with the Egyptian paganism.
Does God take them to Mount Sinai to try to scare them into submission? Hey, you better listen to me, I'm shaking the ground beneath your feet, and I can throw lightning bolts down here and set you ablaze quicker than you can blink your eyes. Is he trying to scare them?
Oh, I don't think so, but I think that he had to show them that he was bigger than all the forces of nature, that he was somehow in control of all of those things.
Yeah.
And so he was bigger than any of the Egyptian gods they'd ever grown up hearing about. So here's this God that is so powerful beyond anything they've ever known. I think their human reaction was very natural. They were afraid.
So here's a justifiable respect that God is trying to establish. What do you
Reverence,
think?
yeah. I think
A
that's-
reverence and respect for who he really was and the authority that he has. There should be a healthy respect for that. Okay, and I think that they were scared and afraid. But Moses, what's Moses say? Moses says, "Do not fear, for the Lord has come to do what? To test you, and that his fear may be before you, so that you will not sin." For the people stood afar off, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. So Moses basically says, hey, let me show you. I'm going to go, and I'm going to go right into the thick of it, and I will survive. So, again, some of these reasons that we're looking at here, a special calling to keep for God to keep his promise, to provide a written transcript of his law, to test the people.
Susan says to establish his covenant with them.
To establish his covenant, absolutely. To reveal the nature of holiness, to show respect and reverence, to establish a deterrent for sin. So, God is accomplishing so much by bringing the people into this special relationship with him. Does he do the same thing today? Does he take all of us individually to our own Mount Sinai? Is God trying to establish a special relationship with us as we prepare for really the epilogue in the plan of salvation, for the end time events to play out?
Absolutely.
Okay, so really, individually, we are being called to our own Mount Sinai, just like these people here.
I think our whole world is being called to that experience, because we're going to see a time ahead where every earthly support's cut off, where everything
Exactly.
we depend on, our jobs, our income, our place to live, everything is going to be in question. We, just like the Israelites, they left and had nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever they could carry. you know, their
They
animals
didn't even
or
have time to
wagons.
put leaven in the bread.
Right, so they left with just what they had on.
Yep.
And God established them from that, but you know, we're so self-dependent, materialistic, and
Yeah.
so He has to bring us to the place
He has
where
to.
all of that gets wiped
So
out.
circumstances will, and so all of those circumstances that will play out at the end, they're intended to be blessings. Many people will think, this is hard. This is
Oh, it's gonna be hard.
hardship.
It is a
You know,
hardship.
This is, well, they're not going to be wanting to go through that hardship, and we need to, just like these people, some of them had to recognize that this was a special calling. God is telling them that. This is why you're here, right? This is what I want to accomplish with you. The same thing has to happen with us today. God is calling us because He wants to accomplish something special, right? He has to prepare people for translation. He has to, He has to get us ready. We have to be standing in His law. We have to be standing in His holiness, in His righteousness, right? And it was this lesson of the sanctuary that really prepared these people to, in other words, they didn't move on from Mount Sinai until after they had the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was going to be the detail of the Exodus, of the Passover. The Passover, you had to put the blood on the doorpost, right? In other words, the blood had to be shed, the blood had to be applied. God now gives them the detail of all of that, the significance of the shedding of the blood and the application of the blood. And I'm sure back then somebody had to understand exactly what that all meant.
I think looking at the whole scenario, I see Him bringing people to the point of recognizing, I can't do anything about this. I have to become totally dependent on Him.
And really the covenant too, and I think because of our misunderstanding of what the covenant actually is, the true covenant is expressed in the tabernacle service. The true covenant is a relationship and cooperation between the Father and the Son, okay, coming together.
Doing what had to be done to save us in order to
where we come in is that we agree with what they're doing. We believe in what their covenant is establishing. That's in other words, we stand in awe of what they're doing, and that's where we cooperate.
Susan says, and we can trust He will hide us in the cleft of the rock as He did Moses.
Yeah, Susan, yeah, that's great. That's great. Absolutely. So we just need to cooperate with God in the process that He's the script that He's already written. But I just want people to understand that we're going to do this. We're going to have our own exodus. We're going to come out and go into the wilderness ourselves as we approach the end.
Well, the
We're
very
gonna-
first
we're gonna
call
leave-
is come out of her, my
We're going to
people.
leave everything
We
behind.
have to get out of this whole Babylonian system, and God's preparing us now by changing our mindsets.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of people that are going to come out at the very end who are going to have to learn what
Quickly.
we've been working
Pushing
on
it.
for years.
Yes, absolutely.
They're going to have to learn this in a matter of
Yeah.
hours or days or whatever.
And maybe they won't even fully understand it. Maybe there will be just a few that will fully understand it. But I firmly believe that certainly the 144,000 will know and understand, because we're told in Revelation 15, they sing the song of Moses and the Lamb.
But
They
those who
sing,
come out at the end will need the encouragement and the steadfastness of those who've already developed a walk with Him.
Yeah.
That will be huge in helping them get through that crisis, because if they had to go through it without anybody
any
to
support,
guide them,
any support.
and
yeah.
sort of say, yeah, we've been through this before and we've got some ideas of
Yeah.
how we can survive or whatever.
Definitely need moral
That's
support for
huge.
that. So, but just like this story here, we read about it in history. There was specific reasons why God was calling these people to this special relationship. He's doing the very same thing with people today in the world, calling them to this special relationship to accomplish a special objective, and that is to prepare ourselves and the world for translation. And we're going to go through some of the similar things. The key factor here is understanding the tabernacle service, understanding the relationship, the plan that God, the script that God's written, having an understanding, and singing that song, singing the song of the atonement. That's what's important. That's what God did for His people then. That's what He's doing for His people now. Okay? It's very real. It's just as real as when He stood on this mountain and lit it on fire. It's just that real. Okay? So, what we'll do is next week we'll pick up the story of, get into more of the detail where God is writing the transcript. You know, what's really interesting to me is that here he is giving the law. The law always existed from the beginning, right? You know, from Adam and Eve, the law was written on their hearts. But after sin, corruption, the heart became corrupted, and the law was pushed aside, pushed out. Here God is writing down these principles for these people. He's helping them. In fact, what does the Bible say? In the fourth commandment, to remember the Sabbath. You can't remember something if it didn't already exist. All right? So God is writing these out for these people. So He gives them the real law, a real transcript of His law. But the real blood, the two things that God really offered as His two witnesses to the plan of salvation, the real law written with His own finger and the real blood from His own side, that real blood wouldn't come from His own side for thousands of, for what, 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later, right? They were probably at Mount Sinai. Well, some people say 1450 BC, so about 1,500 years. You got a space of approximately 1,500 years where you have the first witness, God's writing his law, and then the other witness is a space. Why do you think there's a space of 1,500 years there approximately? Because the way the tabernacle service was set up, they had the real law, but they were using animal blood.
Isn't there
symbol,
kind of
right?
a cycle of events? I mean, the first 1,500 years before the flood, and then you've
Right.
got about 1,500 years until the crucifixion.
From Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's probably some correlation in there, some timing in there that maybe we need to look at a little closer. But it's just interesting that the two components that God would contribute directly in accomplishing the atonement and the plan of salvation, there's a space of about 1,500 years. Now for us, for God, that's like a day and a half, right? Like a day and a half. So from His perspective, relatively quickly. But I imagine that
Scott has a comment. As Moses presented the second set of stone tablets to God for Him to write His law on them, so we must present our hearts to God for Him to write His law on our hearts.
oh yeah, very good point.
Great analogy.
Yeah, and that's especially important now. When there are a lot of people around saying that the law was done away with and it was nailed to the cross and it's not important anymore. That's what you would expect. You would expect the enemy to come up with those kind of things. That the very thing that is necessary, the enemy would say, forget it. It's not necessary. So, anyway, great to have everybody chiming in this morning, and great to have you folks as well, adding some perspective. We'll pick up the story next week. Simeon will be leading out, I believe. But if not, we'll continue the next couple of weeks dealing with right here in Exodus. All right. Okay, our time is gone. It happens all too quickly. But let me invite you to pause a sec, and we'll close in prayer. Father, we want to thank you. We want to praise you for your wonderful plan of salvation. All these marvelous examples in Scripture of how you led your people step by step to a greater understanding of who you are and what it is that you wanted to accomplish in the world. And through a people. You could send angels to sound the trumpet, but yet you have enlisted our cooperation. How important that is, that we trust you completely in that process. And so we pray, Lord, that you'll strengthen us, that you'll guide and direct us, and that you'll definitely use us in the finishing of your great work. We ask that you continue to bless us for the rest of the Sabbath, and those that have watched, and those that honor you. And we also ask, Lord, that you would bless our fellowship the rest of this day and the food that you've prepared. And we trust that others as well around the world will receive that blessing from you. And we ask these mercies in your wonderful, wonderful miracle-working name. Thank you for working a miracle in our hearts, just as surely as you did at the Red Sea and Mount Sinai. And we ask these mercies in Jesus' wonderful name. Amen and amen. Okay, well, thank you once again for tuning in, for checking in with us. We'll see you again next week, right here, same place. Until then, have a great week, and may the Lord continue to bless you this Sabbath.